close to half of the people there were, yeah, we've deployed something. We've not just deployed something to production, but we have tracked ROI. I have agents that are being, served up in the applications that I already use. My large scale things like Salesforce and ServiceNow and Workday and like all these big enterprise applications that I use are now building out agents internally. How do I know that the agent that's coming in natively out of the box in my enterprise applications or in my hyperscalers tools is doing as well as I want it to do? And how do I know when I need to actually go build my own version? That is a really, really big problem coming for people.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Data Innovators and Builders. Today, I'm speaking with Conor Jensen, Global Field CDO at Dataiku. Conor, thanks for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Saka. I'm very excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. So, Conor, to get started, give us a little bit about background. What do you do in your role, and how did you get to that?
Sure. So, the short version. So the Field CDO team here, there's a handful of us around the globe, and we are really, I think of as sort of the technical executive support, right? So we're here to have conversations with the executives at our customers, whether it's the technical executives talking to CIOs, talking to CDOs, or to the business executives, but sort of bridging that technical gap that sometimes exists there. All of us have come from technical or technical leadership roles. I actually came from a customer over to Dataiku, and so have always been in the customer-facing side while I've been here, either leading some of our customer success or services and data science efforts, and now leading this team. But I really view it as really just working with my former peers. I often sort of say it when I'm introducing myself to customers is, I've sat in their shoes, I've built platforms, I've led teams, I've done all the initiatives, and my job here is to help them make different mistakes than the ones that I've already made or that I've watched other customers make, and help them make new mistakes together.
Awesome. I think that actually gives a very, very good perspective, especially in today's world. There's so much focus on what's the business outcome for customers. And technology is merely the tool, the enabler, right? So the focus on customer outcomes is extremely important and valuable, especially with AI adoption. And coming in a technical role, talking to senior execs at companies, I'm sure you're talking about all these AI projects. Now, we've been hearing about the state of AI projects and their adoption. Tell us a little bit about what is the state of affairs? Are projects going into production? What is going on in that front?
There's a certain aspect of this sort of the new world of AI that feels very much the same as the old world of data, whatever we've called it, right? And it's so it feels like the names change, data mining, data, BI, dashboards, data science, et cetera. Sort of feels like we have the same conversation every 4 or 5 years with a new name. So there's some aspect of that of where the same challenges apply, and we still see the same reports of 80% of projects never make it past prototype or production. And while there is still truth to that, and certainly we see a lot of projects that don't go to production, especially for the where we're at in this sort of really only 2.5, 3 years into the real explosion of generative AI and now agentic work, I'm seeing more traction and more stuff going really, for real into production than I think we saw 2 or 3 years into the wave of data science or machine learning or data mining. I recently I was at the Gartner conference, last month, I guess, now last month in Orlando, and was doing a workshop with a bunch of different executives. And we were sort of talking about maturity and different stages of it and what are the things that take you to get from one to another. But I started from the premise that we really take with our customers is sort of like prototyping or testing, putting the toe in the water of testing this stuff out, like really isn't doing anything anymore. I feel like that's usually that first stage of maturity is that you're sort of like prototyping, you're testing things out. And, we really think about it from through the lens of success. And so, for us, level one is you've shown ROI and you have success with something that you have built and you have deployed. And so I started that as the framing and sort of said, who in the room is level one, who in the room is level two, which is, of course, then you're starting to use reproducible assets across the organization and scaling, et cetera. And, I'd say let's call it, quarter of the room, maybe a third, sort of said they were level one. 4 or 5 people said they were level two, and then that was it, right? And I sort of said, okay, great, let's talk about what it takes to get on the board. But it's helpful to start from the fact that in that room, not quite a half, but close to half of the people there were, yeah, we've deployed something. We've not just deployed something to production, but we have tracked ROI. We know that we have been successful with some of the investments that we're making. And that to me felt pretty consistent with the conversations I have, and some of the people in the room were customers and some were not. So, it wasn't simply Dataiku folks, but that to me is really exciting because I think that that does at least come a little bit against the naysaying that can come when you read all the McKinsey studies, the Deloitte studies, the 90%, 80% of, things are failing. It's true, it's still hard and not everybody is being successful yet, but, to look at the amount of investment that's gone in the last couple of years and the fact that really just 2 years into this, embracing new stuff, LLMs, all these, new tools, new technologies that people are already starting to show ROI on that, that's encouraging to me, though we still have a long way to go.
I feel personally that in maybe the last 6 to 7 months, as people have seen the success of um, AI-driven code development and how it has impacted engineering and the amount of impact it has created, that it has at least proven to people that a really large impact is possible. They're seeing that maybe in teams next to them in the company, and I think that it is much more realistic to assume that this and a massive shift can come in other areas. So I think that has certainly started to happen, at least in my experience. So when you were talking to these CIOs at
Mhm.
Gartner, I'm sure that many of them want to be bringing AI, and it's not like people don't want to. I think that is certainly happening. Were you able to identify like where people are making mistakes and um, versus what are people doing that's making them successful?
The things that came in as sort of negatives, or challenges that people had either had to overcome or had, especially, I always love the question of what would you do differently if you went back to
Mhm.
this again, right? Um, One of the ones that we heard a lot was really around like legal and governance challenges, and in terms of like how well they were working with those functions within their organization. Um, the companies that were being successful were able to tell pretty good stories, non-trivial effort, right? It wasn't just like, we talked to legal and they said, good, we're good to go. Let's, like there was definitely effort and work that went into that. But that was one where the earlier and the more involved people were with working with those sort of compliance and legal type functions, the more successful they were on later on, though sometimes feels like you're sort of slowing down early to go fast later. That was a big one for sure. The second one is the same old story is of, how good is the data that we're starting with? Have we done some of the homework in the background on good, good access to data, data governance, especially things around sort of metadata and that type of stuff, is just that the more that companies have invested in that, the quicker they are able to move in sort of the world of AI. And it doesn't mean that you have to have been, that you have perfect data governance, you've got data stewards or all these different things that we've talked about. I think a lot of time people have sometimes let the, perfect ideal of what data governance could be the enemy of actually doing something real and then like building with it. And so finding that sweet spot, because we definitely had some people say, well, our data is crap, so we haven't done anything. You're like, okay, well, that's you have to start. You have to start moving somewhere. You find some data, you clean it up, and you start doing something. You can't say, "We'll wait until the data is perfect before we do anything." That doesn't work either. But nor does, well, we keep hiring a CDO, and they say, "Here's all this, investment we need to do in fixing our data," and they go, "Well, it's been a year, you didn't do anything. Let's go find a new CDO and start this dance all over again." And so that's again, not a new story, but I think something that is acutely coming home. Those deferred investments in sort of cleaning up our data are coming home to roost right now and really slowing some companies down. Um, the third one that definitely came out kind of repeatedly was the companies that were really successful were doing a really good job of taking a sort of business first idea that they were working their way back from. I think that in the rush for companies to say that they've been doing AI, there's been a lot of, oh, we gave everybody Copilot, and that means we're doing
Hmm.
AI now.
Yeah.
And then they come back sort of 6 months later. They go, okay, so what have we gotten for this investment? What have we done? Sure, maybe some things have sped up incrementally, right? But rather than sort of taking it from the like, hey, here's a very specific problem that we know if we've addressed it, we have a metric for it, we can sort of track all of that. Um, that has been definitely been much more successful than we'll just give everybody a tool, then they'll figure out how to be successful with it. That's sort of very purposeful and intentful. And they can go wide pretty quickly after that once they, started to show that. But, the going sort of wide too early doesn't tend to be as successful as you'd hope.
Yeah, and you mentioned that some of the leaders you talked to at the Gartner conference, they mentioned that they have had a positive ROI that they measured, right? And I guess it's partly coming from picking the right problem in alignment with business, right?
And I'd say and that's again one of those sort of things that I remember doing a survey of customers. Trying to remember, I remember like presenting it on stage at a conference in Sweden. So maybe 3 years ago, I think was when I was at that conference. It's like weird to sort of time box stuff. So 3 or so years ago, so a little bit before the sort of like explosion of generative AI, and where I'd done a survey with a bunch of our customers, looking at like what had worked and what hadn't worked. And one of the
Hmm.
things that I didn't expect going into that sort of survey, but really came out was that companies are really effective and had a good process for managing their sort of like data product roadmap. Like you very rarely their words, but sort of how I'll describe it of like the roadmap of how they picked, how they moved forward, how they decided when to start and stop projects, all that sort of stuff was actually incredibly important. And it's sort of one of those things that it's like, it like warmed my heart a little bit because I've always thought it was important, but it was really interesting to sort of see. So maybe hopefully I wasn't leading the witnesses when I did that survey, but that ability as an organization to effectively say, hey, here's 5, 10, 50, 100, 500 use cases that have come our way. And honestly, it's harder when it's 500 than it is when it's, 10 of saying, where are we going to pick and how are we going to move forward? That is a skill that is proving incredibly important right now because so many people are coming out and that's great. I mean, more people coming and saying, "Hey, could we do this with AI? Could we do that with AI?" Everything like that. That is a great problem for most organizations to be in compared to sort of feeling you were swimming upstream trying to roll stuff out sometimes in the past. But if you don't know how to really look at all those requests and say, here's where we should place our bet and here's where we're going to focus, then you're either spreading yourself too thin or you're saying no to stuff that actually could be really valuable. But that was definitely something. It's again, it's a consistent theme that's come through, and that skill to be able to do that for some of those lower I want to say like maybe lower maturity data products that we've
Hmm.
done in the past. Um, the other thing that I think is helpful in noting in that I've really enjoyed seeing more of in the last couple of years is I've seen far too often where organizations have sort of disparate pipelines for different types of data products because the RPA team sits, maybe in IT somewhere. And so, when somebody comes to that team, they says, I want you to solve this problem for me. And they solve it with RPA because they're the RPA team. And you have the BI team. And maybe that sits in IT or sits in data or, depending on where it is. But the same thing. Somebody comes to me and says, I have this business problem. And you go, okay, cool. We'll build a report for you, or we'll build you a dashboard, or we'll do whatever you need to have. And you have a data science team. And, then you started to see Gen AI teams, right? But these were all distinct teams with distinct
Yeah.
pipelines that, they would do their work with. And where we've seen the customers who have been more successful in getting that ROI more quickly is having a much more sort of shared pipeline for those sort of data requests that their internal customers, their colleagues are coming with to say, hey, okay, you came to us with this business problem you're trying to solve based on the maturity, your data, what it would take to solve this. This feels like something that we should do with machine learning. So we're going to give that to the machine learning team. Um, this one is honestly, it's just bad data. And you just need like the data engineering team to come in and clean up and structure some of your data. And then we can go from there. Or maybe this is, wow, you've got some good data here. There's a lot of things. It's a bunch of unstructured data, or it's whatever the reason is, this should go to that generative AI team. And so that skill of, again, how do I take a business problem, diagnose it, turn it into an analytical or some sort of data problem to solve, give it to the right team and let them solve and go back, is a humongous impact on those companies that have and have not been successful because of their ability to do that.
I think there are two important things you shared, which I think we have to look at as an intersection to find the right problem. One is you mentioned, hey, can I do this with AI is a question that comes up, right? And the other thing you talked about was data product. So on the first one, I know that in practice, what you can do with AI and where it hits its limitations or the quality or all of those aspects that come in, and where people may have an idea of what can because they've seen that in YouTube or somebody has talked about it or somebody posted on Twitter. How do you see that gap being sort of traversed? Because sometimes the ideas are, um, I would say, a little bit too ambitious. Yeah.
It's a great question. I think one of it is just having the first, and maybe this is a cop out answer, but the first is having the right people in your organization that understand what you can and can't do with AI. And I think that there's a real risk, honestly, that I've seen in some organizations, and I don't want to I sort of want to say this carefully, but I'm seeing a larger number of people being put in charge of AI initiatives that aren't technologists. They're coming from the business or they're coming from like HR way of working teams or things like that. And I'm excited about that, right? I think the closer that we could be to the business when we're trying to, figure out where to put our efforts, I am all for that. But what I have also seen in some cases is those people not surrounding themselves with the people that can answer these questions, right? Because, if you aren't a data person and you're not a technology person, and I guess it's fair to say, so, when I about 12, 13, 14 years ago, somewhere in that time frame, I was working in a data science team. I'm a mathematician by education. Had come out of meteorology and working in retail before that. I'm not a technologist by background. I've never been in IT. I failed CS 101 twice, when I was 18, right? So very clearly, like, I'm not an IT and meta tech person. And then I got put in charge of this data architecture project for this data science team that we were doing. And it was a humongous hill for me to climb to sort of learn, go from walking out of the first meeting and leaning over to my boss and being like, what's an API, right? Like had nothing, right? To Hadoop and Spark and learning all those different things. And it was a huge amount of effort for me. And I put a lot of time and energy into learning it, but I also surrounded myself with people that really could help me answer those questions, got good at, knowing what I needed to defer to. And my boss did a great job of that too, of, he knew what he could defer to me. He knew, what I was learning. I put the right team in place around me to help me answer these questions. And I think that that is a harder part for the people who are leading AI in a lot of these cases, especially if they don't have that technical background, right? If you're coming from IT, being put in charge of an AI thing, then learning the business side is actually, I think, the flip side of this coin of how do I understand what the business is or isn't doing. But really being able to say, okay, people brought me these two ideas that to them sound really close, right? This is really similar. This one I can hand to the machine learning team. I know that we've got the data to sort of solve it. We can go and try to build this. And, probably you can have something in production in 3 weeks that will help them go forth and do this. This other thing that to them sounds pretty similar, if I could solve this problem, I'd be a billionaire. And like the technology is not there, the data is not there. It's something different. Like those can seem really subtle if you're not on this side of the fence. And so, like, focusing on having the right people. I think we've talked about this role on and off for
Yeah.
years of the data translator or the analytics architect or whatever. It's something we keep talking about, and it's never really coalesced into a dedicated role. Um, I still think there's a need for that function, whether or not it's a dedicated role, that ability to take, again, a business problem and say, what would it take to solve this from a data perspective? We, when I was leading our data science team and we do services, projects with our customers, we had a very well built sort of scoping process and a kickoff process where, it was here's the couple pages of detail that, gives us a sense of, is this something that we can solve, right? Is this something we can solve? How long, ballpark, how big of an effort is this going to be, all that type of stuff. But before we then signed on the dotted line to go and deliver this project, if they were interested in everything, then we had like a much longer version that sort of was like, okay, here's data sources, people who are going to use it, like all of that type of stuff. And I think that those questions become really, really important. And one of the things that is a super common stumbling block as you go from that sort of like initial high level where you're like, yeah, we can do this to, oh, wait, maybe we can't do this is, I think one is, I guess so, two main things that I think happen there. One is very much obviously the data. Um, what is the data that we have available to solve this? What kind of form is it in? And, do we have, whatever it is that we're trying to predict, do we have enough data to be able to sort of do that with confidence? And, I remember a project I did when I was still on the corporate side where, we looked at this thing that we were going to build. It was a predictive model to, help solve, there's an insurance, one of our lines of business of more accurately um, pricing stuff. And we said, this is going to affect this much of our business, right? So, I mean, a massive number or something, something like $12 billion a year in like revenue for the company or something like this humongous thing. No, 4 billion. It was 4 billion. And then when we started to dig into it, you realize for the same sort of like high level product line, there was actually like 4 or 5 different pricing structures and data structures under that. And when we really dug into it, we're like, okay, well, we can actually affect about like 400 million of this, which, okay, that's a big number. It's an order of magnitude smaller than where we started. And, really digging into saying what sort of data do we have? Is it available? All of that, we couldn't solve the whole problem. We could really only solve 10% of the problem.
Yeah.
And, I think that's still went well and we were happy with what we did, but it wasn't what we set out to do because we didn't ask the right questions about the data, how much is available, all of that type of stuff. The other side of this is who's going to use what we're building? And more to the point, what is the process for what they do to solve this problem today? And this to me is, I'd say, actually one of the biggest gaps in data and AI teams is people who are really good at sort of process mapping, process understand. Because when we come in to solve a business problem for one of our teams using AI or sort of other methods, there's an existing process for what people do today.
Yeah.
And we are often sort of look at like one piece of that process and say, I have the data to make this easier. And then you give it to them and then don't really have a good enough understanding of how that changes their existing process. Does it slot right into it? How does that all sort of look? And that's an area where we fall down very, very frequently. And some of our customers who have been disproportionately successful with their AI initiatives have like process engineering teams or something similar to that, either embedded or right next to their data and AI teams. And so anytime they're taking on a project that's going to affect, a substantial number of people, right? Anything more than sort of like we're building something for a little team and they'll figure it out. That's the first step is like, how do we understand what data information, how are people doing this today? And then say, here's how we think this process will change when we roll this out. And then you can more effectively do change management and everything, but you also can build better when you really understand the process that you're building into. So yeah, so I think that those I guess 2.5, not quite 3 things are the things that I really sort of see that make the difference.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're very right. I think, of course, the process that exists today becomes an important part of the context, I would say, to the solution that you're building. Right? It may be an improvement, it may be a replacement, it may be a more sort of efficient way of doing the same thing or more accurate way of doing the same thing. Um, but then, to some extent, as you said, be surrounded by people who know and can answer certain sort of those details. Part of the thing with AI is that it's also moving at a very fast pace. So staying informed is a continuous process, and I would very much sort of say that it is part of everybody's job now to be informed. It's not like a nice to have, and if you know the things today, maybe 3 months down the line you're already outdated. So it's kind of a critical part to that. Because what is possible today versus what's possible in a few months may be different, right? So that's the constant changing thing, right?
It's constantly changing. I actually feel, I think to your point, I look at that journey that I went through 12 years ago, and I remember looking at, sort of this Hadoop landscapes and things like that, and it was a lot to learn and absorb. And I mean, it was so much smaller than what somebody who is starting this journey today has to try to absorb. I mean, that happens to me on a near weekly basis, talking with a customer, talking with a potential customer that says, "Oh, well, how do you guys compare to, or what do you think about this product?" And I'm like, I I just heard about it 3 seconds ago, so I don't know, I'm gonna have to go dig in, and I mean, that happens to me every week, and some of them you look at and you're like, "Well, that's a really cool product." Some of you look at it, "Well, that's vaporware." But, like, either way, I've spent, again, more than a decade in this space on the tech side or buying the tech, so I'm pretty good now at being able to sort of quickly dig in and figure out if something is real or not or whatever, but every week, literally
Yeah,
every week, something is coming across my desk that I have never heard of, and it's a lot for me, and this is my job.
yeah, yeah,
So, everybody's job, I agree with you that it is everybody's job, but it's also, like, the ability to build that filter for looking at tech, figuring it out, all of that, like, that's a high bar to ask of sort of everybody. So, everybody has to probably get a little bit of it, like,
yeah, yeah,
but we
yeah.
need to then institutionally have a really good filter for doing that, that isn't just no, or is it just yes, right? Somewhere in between no and yes is the right answer.
Yeah, no, the value of information is definitely decaying at an exponential rate, way faster than it used to. Um, One of the things you've mentioned multiple times, Connor, is data products, right? And data products is something that we've been doing in some shape or form, but it started to really crystallize maybe 3, 4 years back in the context of analytics and democratization and data mesh
Mhm.
and so on. So maybe give us a little bit of context on the role that data products are playing in AI.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I was actually just at a customer earlier this week, and we sort of had this same conversation. And I use the word data products very explicitly and very deliberately because for me, starting out in this world of building, predictive models and machine learning models, they were very much managed like projects. Like we were managing MIT, there was a project manager. It was a little bit waterfall, and we sort of worked our way into the agile idea, but they were treated as a thing that, you had built and then you gave it away and then you were done, right? And then, maybe you came back to do a V2 sometime later or something like that, but we really treated them as sort of a project and a one time, and then you delivered the project and you walked away. And the shift for me really sort of came when I started thinking about them as products, as things that, we need to take, it's not project management, it's product management. And and then again, very broadly, it's data products because everything that we're creating that's starting from data is an attempt to, in my mind, map or and then I over its sophistication, use that map to predict something about the underlying reality, right? Like data gives us a slice of the world that we can turn into a way to understand what's happening in the world. And then we can use, you know, machine learning and AI to then predict based on our understanding of that. But the data that maps that real world, the real world keeps shifting underneath our feet every second, right? And so when you create a data product, be it a machine learning model, a new version of an LLM or an agent or something, the moment you release that into the wild is the best it will ever be. And it is a point in time of data that created that model, and then reality keeps on shifting out from underneath it. And so our ability to manage these things as living products that have to exist in an orchestration framework where the data is going to keep moving, the world's going to keep moving, we have to continually like own, update, maintain, kill, rebirth, etc. These that's why I really it's important for me to think about these as products, but all of them are data products. I'm building a table, that's a data product. I'm building an agent, that's a data product because they all rely at the end of the day on the same underlying raw materials to get to that outcome.
That sort of framing and is important to sort of treat the data as a product, and then understand also what data products are available, what's the quality with them. um, is One of the things that we are seeing is that data product becomes an entity, and then there's a lot of context around that data entity, around the data product that you can also make part of the whole thing
Mhm.
to make it also, I would say, an AI ready data product. So do you see any sort of line of demarcation between just data product and what's AI ready as a data product?
The increasingly popular notion of semantic models and context models and that layer, I think
Yeah.
that's a huge piece of it. You know, even for training an agent or anything like that, just having metadata on top of, what we had created was already a huge step. And that was the same in the predictive modeling and the modeling world or machine learning world. It's also very then true here in the world, especially as we get into the agentic side of things you know, can we provide the agent with context around it? And that need is only much stronger today, especially as we're trying to give agents access to structured data, to unstructured data, to other agents. What does this agent do?
Uh-huh.
I think that was certainly a very popular topic at Gartner this year, and a growing topic of where the industry is realizing that. And again, it feels sort of, well, we know this, right? When we started building RAGs pipelines 2 years ago, it was, hey, did you add the page numbers of the PDF into the RAG to do it? And it
Yeah.
performs better. If you have descriptors, if you have, uh, definition, dictionaries that you can feed it, all those things help. So they're not really surprising, but that need is incredibly important to really be able to do that. The other challenge that I'm really seeing here, though, is yes, the context, the semantics, all that type of stuff that we're trying to build these AI products to make them more successful is important, but also the flip side of how do we know whether or not the agent is doing a good job? And this is a conversation that I hear a lot from customers and I shouldn't say a lot, like this is almost a universal conversation at this point in time with every executive that I talk with from one of our customers is I have agents that are being, served up in the applications that I already use, my large scale things like Salesforce and ServiceNow and Workday and like all these big enterprise applications that I use are now building out agents internally. Great. I also then have, of course, the hyperscalers that I'm working with. So I've got Gemini or I have Bedrock or I have, Azure OpenAI or whatever I'm using. Those have increasingly, or I'm actually working with OpenAI and Anthropic and they of course had agents that they're building out and deploying and doing that. I also am using tools like Databricks and Snowflake and Dataiku and Glean and things like that to build my own agents and deploy them. So now I have agents that are being deployed in all these different systems. And in this last case, I can control that context and these things that we were just talking about. And I
Mm-hmm.
did the evaluation on it and I know the agent's doing a good job. But how do I know how well the agents that are coming out of the box and the other tools are doing? Because I can't, or maybe they ask for here's a place where you can get it semantics, but that is an evolutionary step that's very much still in flux, right? And so how do I know that the agent that's coming in natively out of the box in my enterprise applications or in my hyperscalers tools is doing as well as I want it to do? And how do I know when I need to actually go build my own version? And this is an area that we're really focused on. I'm super focused on it sort of personally just because of this, but we have, just recently announced a new product coming later this year that is specifically focused on agent management because this question of a, I guess I sort of even skip past the orchestration side of it because the context for one agent could be another agent or another data product, but it's in a different system. It's different data. I want my customer data in Salesforce to see my product data that's sitting in my PLM system or something like that. So that's already one problem of sort of how do I provide the orchestration for these agents to see other agents and other systems and everything. And yes, the world of MCP and A2A MCP more so, at least in practice, and A2A theoretically, if people really start using it, I talk about it a lot. I'm still not seeing people use it, but anyways, we're all talking about it.
Yeah.
That that part is a hard step one. Can I use the context? I mean, can I use the data governance or the data cataloging that I've done where I've built some of this stuff? How do I actually feed that into these agents? That orchestration across systems and platforms is hard. And then on the back end, how do I know that the agents are doing well? How do I know that this one that's out of the box in this system is doing what I want it to do? Oh, I can't. it's doing okay. I'm not sure. Maybe I need to go build my own version of this where I can give it the context and I can do all those sorts of things. And so that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges facing over the next couple of years, because we've talked a lot today, and I think a lot of times we talk about the building of an agent and the deploying
Uh-huh.
it. And hopefully we've got smart people and we've solved some of these problems that you and I are talking about already to make sure that what we're building and deploying is good. But that is a fraction of the agents that are being offered to us to use out of the larger scale platforms we have, and knowing when to use one, how to improve it, all of that is a really, really big problem coming for people.
I think in many ways, I feel like building or the tool to build an agent itself is an important component, but it will be the smaller of the components in the sense that what the agent does and how well does it work, it all becomes again the function of what data product you have and what can it access, and how maybe I agree with you on A2A is not adopted there yet. But yeah, at some point when agents are mature, that these agents exist in the enterprise, and yes, there would be potentially A2A as well. So that that part of the equation turns out to be a lot bigger, is getting that context to the agent and helping and allowing them to interact with the various systems that they need to.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe let's think about how the data teams are operating, and I want to get your thoughts on that part. Like every team is under pressure to operate more efficiently and do more, leverage AI. Um, you know, um, where are you seeing those opportunities? Where are teams finding leverage in executing data, and maybe the lessons from the software engineering world here?
One place that I'm not seeing it as much, if I'm
Yeah,
really honest, is leveraging some of these code development tools that are out there. Right, Cloud Code is amazing. Codex is cool. GitHub Copilot, like all these are really helpful from a software engineering perspective. They, as of yet, have been less helpful from a data engineering and sort of data product perspective, because, if I'm vibe coding a website or, an application or something like that, I can see and interact with what I've asked it to build, and either the picture is the right picture, the site is the right way, or the button clicks and processes what I told it to process, or it doesn't. And so debugging those is relatively like easy, even if you can't go in and read the underlying JavaScript or, whatever it is that it wrote, or I guess Streamlit or etc. On the data side, that's much harder, right? Take this data, merge it together, join these tables, clean it up, and give me tell me about the statistics of this data. How do I know, like intuitively, that, this data set that I got at the end of the pipeline is the right data or not? Um, that that is an area that I I know that there will be more coming, right?
yeah,
As I joked about, right? Like I've programmed on and off for a long part of my career, but it's never been sort of like my forte. And so the idea of using machine learning or now generative AI to build pipelines for me so I can go off and do the fun part of the data science has always been an exciting sort of promise to me. But it just doesn't work quite so easily, right? Like, yes, I can use Cloud Code and it can develop, all that, but I still have to be able to go and read that SQL or read that Python or whatever it gave me to know if it's doing the things that I need it to be able to do.
yeah,
And I think that's why we see really those tools in the hands of your most experienced people can make them incredibly effective. So that is definitely happening. The somebody that can, people who are good at debugging or who are good at reading Python, experienced managers who've had junior people working for them, giving them crappy code in the past, who can look at, hey, here's 2,000 lines of Python that you just wrote to say, build this pipeline and train this model. I can, I know exactly where I'm going to have to find, if it's right or wrong. Great. But that's only our most experienced people. For the people who are less experienced, that's a much harder challenge. But the challenge, the sort of further compounding that problem is that where scale is coming from most data teams is from the rest of the organization taking on more of the data work. And this is something that, we've had different names for, citizen data science being the
yeah,
sort of most popular one over the last decade, which I think has always been a very exciting, but maybe somewhat flawed notion of, what you can and can't expect people to do. I've never fully bought into the idea of everybody should aspire to become a data scientist and that that's what's going to happen. Everybody will suddenly become like a citizen data scientist because to me, you know, getting access to these tools that makes you be able to use new predictive models and different data and all that sort of stuff is just making you better at the job that you already do, right?
True. Yeah.
This notion was very much shaped for me by my experience in meteorology. So 20 something years ago, I was, trained as a meteorologist in the Air Force. And the guys who were training us at that point in time were all guys who'd learned to forecast in the like 70s and 80s when it was, hand drawing charts and, calculating, various indices by hand and everything. And by the time I, of course, was a forecaster, you have very evolved satellite, you're getting like all this automated computer stuff, you have radar, you have all these different things. And it was a very different job, from 1980 when these guys learned to do it to
Uh-huh.
2004 or 5, whenever I learned to do it. That was a very different thing. But they were meteorologists and I was a meteorologist. Like that was the nature of being a meteorologist had changed and we had access to more data and better tools and all these different things. But we weren't citizen data scientist meteorologists. We were just meteorologists. And I think that that's what, we're seeing happen now is, what it means to be a marketing analyst, what it means to be a fundamental analyst in, the world of finance, what it means to do supply chain, things like that. People are still in supply chain or they're in marketing or they're in, FA or whatever their domain is. They just are able to do more themselves. They have access to new tools. They have access to more data. They have access to these AI tools and things like that that can help them go in and understand the data a little bit better, to do some of that data prep themselves using
Yeah.
things like Alteryx or Dataiku or tools that have some of those more like, again, you don't have to learn SQL to be able to work with data thanks to the tools that are out there now. And I think that somewhere in between the Claude code of here, I spit out some SQL for you, and the I have to go learn SQL is we're going to find like a happy medium of tools that will enable people to work with the output of things like Claude code in a way that's not just debugging code. And that's going to make a real big difference in terms of the world of, again, how do I take a data team and I've got, I'm lucky. I have a few dozen people in my, data engineers, data scientists, and whatever. It's a big department that's not going to get that much bigger, right? Like that's already a big department. It's a big group. The only way you really can accelerate those, sure, those tools like Cloud Code will help those teams get more efficient. But the real efficiency and scale comes from the problems coming to them, the data that's coming to them being in a better shape, people being able to take on the lower hanging use cases themselves. And that's something that I've honestly really seen over the last, I'd say really, yeah, like 3, 4 years is when I was leading teams and leading products, I was very good at, going into doing ideation workshops with my business partners or with our customers to say, what should we work on together? And it was always from the lens of let's ask, whatever. I have a structured way that I go through it and we come out at the end, we've got, a bunch of like ideas. And then I'm going to prioritize those and say, here's a good project for us to come and do for you. And of course, I'm now no longer managing one of our delivery teams. So I'm on a different side of that. So I'm helping customers prioritize for themselves. But what everything tends to fall into is like 3 buckets. Once we have, like a list of projects at the end is, okay, here's a small sliver that is real hardcore actual Gen AI or agentic use cases. That still is the smallest component as we come out to the end. Then there's some number that, are projects that could be done by your COE, your data science team, your AI engineering, whoever, whatever you call it. These are like heavy hitting. There's gnarly data that has to be worked through, or there's some, pretty complex stuff that's done. But then usually like 50, 60% of the projects or the products that people are asking for, they can do themselves if they have access to the right tools and they have access to the data. And that's where true scale comes in is when
Mhm.
if 50 to 60% of your backlog as a leader of AI can be done by the people who are asking for it, if I can enable them with some new tools and some better access to data, now suddenly we've doubled our output and I haven't hired a single person, right? And that's just a starting point. I think that, that sort of 50 to 60% as these tools get better, as the central teams build better data and build, some of these context layers and semantic layers to help all those people, suddenly now an organization can solve 80%, 90% of its problems. It's data, again, problems, business problems with data by itself. And there's a small percentage that's really sort of going through your heavy hitting COE type team. So That to me is really where scale is starting to come from, but where the vast majority of it will come in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, right? I mean, some of these teams have been, I would say, kind of like serving or servicing the internal needs and demands of various teams around. Like maybe it's the marketing team, maybe it's the finance team or sales team and RevOps and all that stuff, right? And but now, if those teams can self-serve a bunch of their use cases because the tooling with AI is able to understand their intent, maybe automate those things, or maybe as a COE team, you've built the harness for them to leverage, then yes, then you have basically, in a way, multiplied your impact, right? So that's kind of basically, I think, is what you've talked about as AI democratization.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One of the things I think you've talked about is that predictive analytics is coming to a dead end. I would love to hear your thoughts on that, if, how you see that evolving.
I don't know that I'd say that predictive analytics is coming to a dead end, but I think a lot of our efforts there come to dead ends is maybe better, or maybe how I meant it. I think the challenge with this world of sort of predictive analytics, predictive modeling, stuff like that, to go back to my analogy earlier, sort of like data being this map of the world that we're trying to use to predict about what's going to happen in the future, is so much of predictive modeling and predictive analytics came out of the digital world, right? Digital marketing, internet clicks, things like that, where we just have these vast, amounts of data because all of the things that we're trying to track and predict are a digital world and a digital experience. And so social media, internet ads, things like that, all it is data. The whole system is data from, like I opened a browser to I bought something or didn't buy something. Like we just have so much information from it. And for 98%, 99% of the organizations that I work with that are not tech companies, too much data is almost never the problem, right? Sometimes there are some cases where, working with auto companies that are dealing with telematics or, so that we obviously do in some, manufacturing or physical world have sensor data that's pretty massive. But also that type of data also ends up being like 99.9% noise. And so, so there's a different challenge of sort of filtering out and using that data appropriately. But when you're thinking about how we can use data to do stuff internally, you know, this is, back to the earlier discussion of like, how do you know it's a good project? How do you be successful there? So you have to really be able to be pretty quick to sort of say like, oh, this is a problem that the data to solve does not exist, right? And maybe we can start tracking it. And this is a piece that doesn't happen far, far too often is, and I saw this, when I was on the other side trying to manage projects and, on this side, certainly see it with our customers. And sometimes they say, we really want to do this. And you come in and you say, okay, this is the type of data that you would need to solve this problem. You don't have that data. Either it's bad and you've just never sort of done it, or you just don't have, you're not capturing it, right? It's not something that's being brought in through your operational systems. Um, you could start to capture that, right? It's adding sensors in a plant. It's just starting to track, POS data. It's whatever that needs to look like. You could set it up to store this, and you can come back to solve this problem in 12 months' time or 24 months' time or something like that. I I can maybe name on one hand the projects or the companies that I saw that said, "Oh, okay, that's a great idea. Let's start investing in capturing that data, and let's come back and talk to you again about it in a year." I mean, and
Hmm.
like one hand is maybe even being generous, right? Like I maybe only need one or two fingers. Like, but this is back to investments in data. It's very hard to make a use case today of I'm going to add a bunch of sensors. I'm going to do this. I'm going to, start tracking this information that may or may not be useful in the future. Because there's always something else to spend your money on as an organization. And when you're dealing with, customers in a physical location, or you're dealing with plants, or you're dealing with all these sort of stuff, like there aren't really many places where you can have that sort of same level of just data fidelity and volume that you have in the sort of digital realm of, where tech companies and social media
Uh-huh.
and internet type stuff happened. And so a lot of those sort of early data science and machine learning techniques that came out of that world were built for problems of big data. And, that was the nomenclature, whatever, 15 years ago. We were all talking about big data. And when you actually went into, again, any non-tech company and you started talking about big data and they're like, well, we have, 1.2 million rows. And you're like,
Yeah,
okay, oh, like, all right, well, we can just do some SQL here, right? This is
yeah,
totally fine. And versus, a friend of mine who works at a physics research laboratory who was telling me about do something, some experiment that they were running. I was like, what kind of data is that? And he's like, oh, the sensor runs for about 6 weeks and we have like 13 or 14 trillion rows that, come out at the
yeah.
end of it with 5,000 data points each. And I was like,
Okay.
wow, okay. You're not doing that in like Python or anything. It's like, we're writing like literally like basic to like the scale of data. I'm like, that's big data. That's not the problem that companies have, is how do I wade through these massive amounts of data? It's like, oh, I have this tiny, tiny bit of data. How do I learn more about this? And so I think that AI can hopefully help us start to do that by, helping us structure and process and bring, some of the unstructured data and create structured data out of it. So there's some promise to solve these in the future, but so many predictive analytics products that we tried to build or wanted to build, the tooling was based on a framework that just doesn't exist. That volume of data, those challenges that were there. And so, I think hopefully we come back to some of those with better data and information in the future. And, as we move out of that, and that I guess is the other challenge that don't see as much in the tech world. It's not nothing, but it's far less prevalent is your legacy technology, right? If you've got 40 years
Yeah.
of data in a mainframe, that mainframe is probably still really robust and great at actually running the operations of whatever it's designed to do there, but it's not giving you data that you can use to do predictive analytics and all of that side of things. And so the legacy technology, the lack of data, all of that sort of stuff has just made it really hard to do a lot of what we wanted to do with sort of predictive analytics in business. And so maybe that's, again, however it was that I phrased that sort of predictive analytics is dead. It's there's so much of it is dead on arrival that you just can't do what you want to do because we just don't have the raw materials to do it.
Going to a conclusion, I would certainly say that it's not as much the volume of data, but it's kind of really getting the variety that is out there, whether it's the legacy data, it's the unstructured data. It's the small amount of data, but it's valuable. Instead of connecting the dots across them, that leads you to real high value outcomes, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've done some projects that did a lot with a little, so it's
Yeah.
definitely, it's not that you have to have the big data, but it is a challenge in working with this. The data was just never, we didn't think about it in that way when we set it up, or once upon a time when the number of fields that you could capture was genuinely limited by the hardware that you had in place. And we've got fields in mainframes that have been used for 40 years that were used for this for the first 5 years, that for the next few years, stuff like this. That sort of information, as you try to go in there and you're like, that just makes our job really, really hard. And sometimes we can solve that and sometimes we can't. And you're just like, all right, I just can't use this data. The people who were there to do that aren't there anymore. I don't write COBOL and it's hard for me to go back and figure out what's gone there. um it's a fun challenge to have, and I think that companies are learning from it and being smarter as they're building new systems and new tech. But the ROI on migrating from these old legacy tech is hard because the tech works. It does what it's supposed to do, and replacing it is very often, nine figures to migrate this stuff to come out to do exactly what you have today, but just on newer technology. And the benefit is there, but it's a long tail to get to that benefit.
No, I 100% agree with you, and that's where I think it's very important to have the ability to judge where the business value comes from. And this brings back to exactly where we started, which is like, hey, where is that business value? What are we going to deliver with that? Do we have the right data, the data products? And yeah, I would agree with you that these migration projects look like modernization, but it's very important to ask the question, like, in the sequence of things, in the ROI sort of outcomes that we're looking for, is this the first thing I want to go after? And maybe it's a good thing to do. I'm not denying that, but maybe that's not the first thing to go after.
How can I start to benefit
Yeah.
from that investment before the 3 or 5 year migration has sort of
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because data migrations don't ever end. They just because there's always new data, there's always new systems. That's always sort of there, and it can't be okay. Well, we're gonna spend 5 years making our data perfect, and then we'll go forward and do. You have to be from the get go understanding how we can work alongside these large modernization projects to build and capture ROI along the way. And that informs then those, modernization products as well. It like helps us do
Yeah.
better on those as we're working with, the actual outcome along the way.
Well, I think one thing that has certainly happened with the adoption of Gen AI is that we're well past the time when the value of projects can be defined in months and years. It has to be days and weeks. I don't think any enterprise has the patience to wait that long. So,
Kind of painful to hear you say that, but I don't disagree at all.
yeah. But it's been a pleasure talking to you, Connor. I
Likewise,
think
likewise.
we can
A
go
lot
on
of-
for a long time, just given the breadth and depth of the topics that we have here today. But it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully I didn't talk too much, but it's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, these are very important topics. Thank you.
All right. Cheers.